Please be seated. Once upon a time, there was a handsome naval pilot and a beautiful young girl who wanted to be an opera singer. The pilot saw the girl standing on the steps of Memorial Baptist Church in downtown Port Arthur, Texas. It was a Sunday, and the girl was wearing white gloves and a skirt that fluttered in the breeze. Here, though, the story gets a little fuzzy. She says he walked over and began a conversation. He says she flirted with him first. In any case, they did fall in love, and in the closing days of World War II, on the last day of March in 1945, they got married, right there at Memorial Baptist Church. They went on to have many adventures in their long life together, including becoming parents to me and my two brothers. I'm telling you this story because the almost unimaginable images of Port Arthur on social media and in the news took me to a place in my memory I hadn't been in decades. Like all of you, I had watched the epic hurricane tear through Houston and surrounding towns. But for me, Port Arthur was different. Port Arthur was where my grandparents lived and where my mother was born and where our family went for Christmases and summer vacations. Suddenly, the tragedy of Hurricane Harvey was very personal. I'm guessing most of you also have family connections, friends, or business interests in the cities and towns affected by Harvey. Even if you don't, you've seen the headlines. Our whole city is underwater, reported the New York Times about Port Arthur. The next day, Washington Post announced Harvey a 1 in 1,000 year flood event. Then came the stories of exploding chemical plants and rising gas prices, and of shelters where people had been brought for safety having to be evacuated. Like the water itself, the flood of terrible news has been overwhelming. Today's gospel lesson is the second half of a single story in the midpoint of Matthew's gospel. Jesus has withdrawn from the crowds and is speaking now only to his closest companions. You will remember from last week Jesus' questions to his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter's famous answer, "You are the Messiah, Son of the living God." It's an A+ response. And Jesus sends Peter to the head of the class by blessing him and telling him he will be the rock upon which his church will stand. But then, with barely a breath in between, the text says, from that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering and be killed. We know what happens next, of course. Peter actually rebukes Jesus. "God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you." And then that stinging counter rebuke, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me." Why, you might be wondering? Why would Jesus talk that way? What made him suddenly turn on Peter, calling him blessed one minute and Satan the next. This pair of lessons last week and this week form the hinge upon which Matthew's gospel turns. Up to this point, Jesus has been on the road healing and teaching, and he has acquired a following in the small towns of Galilee. But now he is preparing for the big leagues, a confrontation with the most powerful religious and political forces of his time: the leadership of the temple in Jerusalem and the might of the Roman Empire. Peter acknowledges Jesus as the long-awaited liberator, but his plan for how to go about it, undergo great suffering and be killed, is unthinkable. It is a scenario, from Peter's point of view, that violates everything they had been moving toward and hoping for. There are lots of ways to unpack this strange exchange between Jesus and Peter, but one I have found helpful is to imagine Jesus and Peter are applying completely different kinds of logic to their common problem. Peter, naturally, is used to the common sense approach, which strives to be first because there's not enough for everyone, which trusts money and power to solve problems, which believes if you've messed up, you should rightly be punished. Who can blame Peter for assuming a Messiah who will handily crush the enemy and restore the glory days of King David? We still think this way, of course. The Twin Towers are destroyed, and we counter with a shock and awe attack. Someone hurts us, we hurt them back, or at least we want to. People who are poor or incarcerated or sleeping on the street are just experiencing the consequences of their, quote, poor choices. But Jesus will have none of it. You are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things, is the way the text reads. Which is another way of saying that Jesus is operating according to a completely different kind of logic. Illogical logic, if you will. The divine logic of paradox, in which everything we think we know gets turned inside out and upside down. Forgiveness is offered again and again and again, and then some more. The first is last, and the last is first. Strength is manifest in weakness, and those who want to save their life must lose it, and those who lose their life will find it. Two kinds of logic, two worldviews, two levels of consciousness, if you will, which matter because they offer two radically different ways of responding when our world falls apart. And it does fall apart. Despite our very best, most sincere, carefully planned strategies to avoid the pain that comes with being alive in a broken world. Whether it's a devastating natural disaster or the chaos of our own personal dramas, there is what Spanish philosopher Miguel de Unamuno called the tragic sense of life. The tragic sense of life. The undeniable fact that our assumptions about how life is supposed to be cannot be upheld. Not because of our failures, not because God wants to test your faith or try your strength, not to punish you for making a wrong move, but because suffering is woven into the very fabric of life. I can't say for sure what was going on between Jesus and Peter in what had to have been a painful exchange for both of them. But I do know this: when we can really hear the cries of the world and honor our own without numbing out or shutting down, when we can muster the courage to turn toward the suffering that swirls all around us, we somehow in that moment cross a threshold into a realm where healing and the miracle of love can have its way. We have put our mind on divine things, you might say. You may have seen reports of the so-called Cajun Navy, a spontaneous volunteer initiative that developed in the aftermath of flooding in Baton Rouge last August. Quoting from an article in the Los Angeles Times is this: on US 90 east of Houston on Wednesday morning, hundreds of trucks, many of them towing boats, were in bumper-to-bumper traffic fording 6 inches of floodwater. And here's the sentence that caught my eye. These drivers weren't fleeing the still swirling storm. They were headed straight for it. 763 boats and more than 1,500 volunteers. Comparing the operation to a Texas-style Dunkirk, the paper went on to say, amateur navies of boaters flocked toward the center of Harvey's wrath from all over Texas and beyond, offering fishing boats, airboats, private catamarans, and pleasure craft as boats of salvation. A Louisiana man who joined a nursing home rescue with his 14-foot aluminum boat said it wasn't hard to decide to come. I lived through Katrina. When we were in trouble 12 years ago, Texans came down to help. And so we are just loving our neighbor back. I don't know about you, but this looks like gospel to me. Boats may have carried those stranded by floodwaters to safety, but it was love that drew the volunteers to sacrifice their own comfort and safety in order to help. And it was love that propelled Jesus toward Jerusalem, and love that invites you and me again and again to open our hearts to the cries of the world. My grandparents have been dead for many years, and my parents moved away from Port Arthur soon after they married. So it is unlikely that I will ever have occasion to go back there. But I can't tell you how much it buoyed up my heart to know that there were strangers who came, and by their selfless presence brought good news of healing and hope to that place that had such an important part of forming me into the person I am today. In my imagination, I see Peter, the fisherman, as a part of that Cajun Navy. A little rough around the edges, perhaps, tired, hungry, and dirty, and not worried a whit about getting his theological ducks in a row, because he's just too busy guiding his boat in order to save one more frightened flood victim. Peter, who learned eventually not to run away. Peter, just loving the world finally, as Jesus taught him. Thanks be to God.